gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this latest episode of CHACR Take Away video interview series, where we feature a leading expert on a topic or question or concern for British Defence and Army. Obviously, these reflect the views of two individuals, not any of the Army or the Ministry of Defense. And today we're discussing NATO. You might have heard the line that NATO is brain dead, but in actuality, NATO has been quite adaptive and reactive to threats that has emerged on its borders, from information to Russian activities to invasion of Ukraine and expansion of other crises on its borders. And we want to unpack some of the questions of the challenges that are facing NATO today, but also the opportunities in its future, in its new direction under the General Secretary, with a lot of great initiatives that are unfolding there. And then maybe tease out some of the implications of what this might mean for British defense and security from now on. And what a better person than actually Lieutenant General Ben Hodges to unpack some of these questions with us. And he's no stranger to a lot of us in the British defense community. At the moment, he's the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and does a lot of great work on particularly Eastern Europe and the Black Sea and questions around NATO and military capabilities and mobilization. For those of you who don't know his background, he retired from the US Army in 2018, and his last two posts, both involved being he was the commanding general of the United States Army in Europe, but also prior to that, he was the commander for the NATO Allied Land Command in Izmir, Turkey. So he sits at the intersection of a lot of these conversations now as a sane, wise voice on strategic questions, but also with a distinguished military career behind him. General, so I suppose really the first question is quite a personal one, but also draws upon from your experiences. I mean, you've been on the ground in European security, NATO and transatlantic alliance questions. You served for CHACR before as well in your career. How have you seen NATO evolve over the years, adapt to the challenges, adapt to the crises that emerged, but also the transatlantic relationship structurally, and how it coped with some of these stresses? And how do you see our history thus far?
Ziya, thank you. Well, you know, everybody refers to NATO as the most successful alliance in the history of the world. And then they criticize it for being brain dead or adaptive or looking for a mission, but still it's the most successful alliance in the history of the world. And that is because the world is a dangerous place and nations need each other. There's a reason that countries are queued up trying to get into NATO, whether we're talking about Georgia, Ukraine, others. Nobody's knocking at the door of the Kremlin saying, please let me in. They're knocking at the door in Brussels saying, please let me in, because they recognize that our alliance, imperfect as it is, represents the best chance for security and stability. Of course, as a lieutenant in Germany in 1981, I was part of America's contribution to NATO and stability and security in Europe, but I didn't really appreciate that. I just knew I was a lieutenant in a mechanized infantry unit in northern Germany and loved it. But as a major, I served as the aide-de-camp for CHACR General Jawan from 1995 to 1997 during the Dayton Peace Accords and the deployment of the I-4, the implementation force, into Bosnia-Herzegovina, and watching the alliance, all the work that was done, the diplomatic work, watching CHACR interact with the Secretary General then was Javier Solana, a guy, by the way, his background is not somebody you would have thought would become Secretary General, but he grew into the job as well because he saw what the alliance was all about. And so seeing that, and then how the alliance transformed to support Afghanistan, and then how quickly we have adapted after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and illegal annexation and occupation of Crimea. I mean, think about where we were in 2014 and where we are now. To me, it's remarkable. And it depends on American leadership, but it depends on all 30 countries now respecting and recognizing the cohesion is what's most important.
And it's fascinating to think, actually, you're right. After 2014, our entire reading of where the trajectory of the things on our borders will go and what does engagement with Russia mean and how their military modernization actually is playing themselves out as new capabilities, from area and access denial to use of little green man to use of information. I mean, it's been quite a wake-up call, for the system to say, hold on a second, maybe we should have woken up in 2008 in Georgia, but it took a while to get there. But clearly NATO has been adopting it. So when you look at it from where you stand now as an independent voice and a thinker on some of the strategic questions, with your military background and career behind you in that geography and in these issues, what are some of the key external challenges and threats you see for NATO? Obviously, there's so much that's unfolded last 18 months. It's been breathless, not just questions of the strategic north and east, but south, as well as questions over Med and other Russian activities in our borders.
Well, for sure, the principal threat right in front of us is Kremlin aggression in the Baltic and Black Sea regions, the challenges to sovereignty, the use of disinformation, cyber, energy, to all of which are intended to undermine the cohesion of NATO. I mean, that's what their strategy is to see the alliance come apart. And so that's the biggest threat to NATO right now. I do worry about the Chinese investment in infrastructure, not just Huawei, but also the bridges and ports and tunnels and highways, all the things that they're doing in much of Central and Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe, because if we're in a crisis, the alliance needs access to this infrastructure, and to have it controlled by Chinese business, Chinese interests, all of which report, of course, to the CCP. I think that creates a vulnerability for us. And of course, the Chinese have a long-term view. That's part of this investment. And NATO provides a framework, not just for defense, but it's also a framework of 30 nations for sharing information, for building consensus that affects policies. And so I think we have to be serious about this. And then finally, of course, Islamic extremism, the terrorist attacks that we see happening just very recently in Vienna, not a NATO, obviously Austria is not a NATO country, but in Paris, these kind of things affect all of us. And the alliance is, I think, again, provides a framework for intelligence sharing, information sharing, and building capabilities.
And you already hinted at it, I think, because in regards to Russian attempts and policy to strain the alliances, which kind of weakens our deterrence, our resilience, and how we respond to some of these external challenges. It seems like one area that we're not discussing a lot, at least publicly, or at least more constructively, is herding the cats within the alliance. In other words, the strategic divergences between key countries that are at the moment shaping our responses, undermining them or directing them or leading them. Obviously, we had the question of Trump administration views on NATO. So with the new election results, with President Biden's history, of President-elect Biden's history on some of these conversations, there's a lot more affirmation and positivity towards the transatlantic alliance, but some of the attitudes on Europeans having to need to do more and actually invest more into defense is not going to disappear with President-elect Biden. But then also we have the France and Turkey stresses, which two countries that have always had their own peculiar threat perceptions and agendas on where things should go, and their own demands on how the alliance should behave. And then now we have the East Med tension between Greece and Turkey, and then Ankara buying S-400s, which kind of is a Trojan horse within the NATO domain. It seems like these internal divergences between the North and the South and the East and the West and the Northwest seems to be an area that we really need to pay attention more. In other words, internal challenge itself is becoming a genuine question of deterrence and resilience. Would that be a fair area that we actually need to say, hold on, after the external challenges, we need to discuss more publicly the internal challenges?
Well, look, this is the nature of coalitions for 5,000 years. Nations come together because they see a common threat or they need each other, but they still retain their own sovereign issues and have their own agenda. So the fact that NATO has stuck together since 1949, and in fact has grown from 12 to 30, shows the remarkable resilience that despite all these internal challenges, and certainly they should begin work right now on a huge statue for Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, who has herded these cats, as you describe, at a time that the alliance had to react fast, and frankly, at a time that the American president was not very helpful. The United States needs to, the American president needs to have a conversation with his own citizens about why it's in our benefit to be in NATO, not to point to European allies and constantly berate them for not spending more on defense. Of course they should be spending more on defense. Of course they should. But even if they didn't spend €1, it's still in the benefit of the United States to have a European pillar, the access that we have for bases, the fact that there are 29 other countries that have shared common values. That doesn't mean we agree with everybody on everything or that we love each other, but we start day one of any crisis with at least 29 other countries generally on the same side. And the American president and American leadership should be able to work through diplomacy with our closest allies to say, hey, look, how can you be importing gas from Russia at the same time that we're trying to protect each other from Russia? Or how can you even be thinking about buying Huawei, which will make it very difficult for us to share intelligence? And this is part of great power competition, and I do believe great power competition prevents great power conflict. If we're competing in diplomatic space, and information space, and the economic space, as well as military, it actually reduces the risk of an out and out conflict. And I think that's what we've got to do. Now, Turkey and Greece, of course, there have been challenges over the last 7 decades, but Turkey has been a member of the alliance since 1952. We had a NATO headquarters in Izmir since 1952, longer than anywhere else in NATO except Naples. I mean, that's no matter who was in charge in Turkey. Turkey has been a reliable ally, a pain at times, but they're not alone in that. Other countries are a pain at times and will veto or slow things down. Regimes change, but the map does not change. And I cannot imagine the alliance without Turkey, and I cannot imagine the alliance without Greece. And if you think about it, every country that's in NATO, every country has been at war multiple times with other members that are now inside the alliance, the US and the UK, Germany and almost everybody, the French with almost everybody. Not just the Greeks and the Ottomans. I mean, so think about the positive effect of everybody belonging to the alliance compared to what would be happening otherwise. I think this is a remarkable achievement and something that we should all continue to invest in.
Yeah, but in fact, I actually agree. I think empirically you could make the case that even though the Greece-Turkey tension highlights the issues that have been left unresolved for decades and decades, actually NATO is the framework within which these things can de-escalate, open the way for diplomacy, right, rather than a tool to beat countries, to kick them out, and etc. But General, what is it that we're not talking about when we think about NATO and threats? I mean, the reason I ask that is, obviously everybody talked a lot for years about the Baltics, for example. Why? Because it was very clear, the possibilities and the risks. We talk about area denial, excess denial. We talk publicly a lot about misinformation, disinformation, instability, little green man, whatever term you use for hybrid warfare or gray zone or sub-threshold. But it seems to me there's so many other topics that are not necessarily getting that much wide media attention, but actually is really important for the alliance. Black Sea was one. I mean, thankfully, last couple of years, we have seen more attention from even the US Navy, from NATO, to the Black Sea. And now Mediterranean issues have again emerged. So the question of strategic south, which has been by and large ignored for a very long time. Libya kind of woke up people to it, but also your work on even military mobility. I mean, how do we actually as an alliance transport things? I mean, it's all good and well to think strategically and big events and bring all the NATO leaders to Sandhurst for a ceremony, but also this nitty-gritty of alliance. So how do we transport things across the continent? And So what are some of these issues that you think actually we're not talking much, but we should really pay attention more, like Black Sea, military mobility? Obviously, interoperability is something we discuss a lot.
Okay, well, you've named most of the key ones. The Black Sea region, I think, should be the priority for NATO, because the Black Sea region, in my view, is actually more strategically important to the Kremlin than even the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea was the right place to focus initially because of the geography, the distance, and the threat was there. And so I think the alliance correctly prioritized Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, getting the EFP battle groups there so quickly. Obviously, the British led battle group in Estonia, having the Germans be the first to step forward with their battle group in Lithuania was powerful. But I think from a deterrent standpoint, it's not perfect, but we're much better than we were, just 4 years ago when the alliance decided to do this. Strategically, the Black Sea region is the launching pad for the Kremlin for everything that they do in Libya and Syria and the Eastern Mediterranean, obviously in the Caucasus, in the Balkans. The Balkans are the kind of the back door into the Black Sea region. And because of Montreux, we are always going to be numerically disadvantaged compared to the Russian Black Sea fleet operating out of its illegal base in Sevastopol. So we've got to figure out how to compete in the Black Sea region. And step one is getting Brussels, London, Paris, Berlin, and Washington to recognize the strategic importance of the Black Sea region. And I think of the Black Sea really as an extension of the Mediterranean. I mean, they're connected by the Turkish Straits, obviously, but this is how Russia is able to continue to support the Assad regime, which has put millions of refugees on the road into Turkey and Europe. Without Russia being able to operate from the Black Sea region into Syria, you wouldn't have as many refugees all over southeastern Europe. This is not an accident. This is what General Breedlove called the weaponization of refugees. I mean, that was an intended outcome by the Kremlin. And then, of course, their support for General Haftar in Libya, potentially another million refugees ready to come across the Mediterranean towards Europe. So that's why the Black Sea region is so important. And then when you think about east-west trade with gas, telecommunications networks, air travel, the only east-west route that does not go through Russia or Iran goes through Georgia and Azerbaijan. So why in the world would we want to end up with Russian peacekeepers anywhere near there? Of course, Russia already has a base in Armenia, but at least that sort of Azerbaijan, Georgia corridor, and then across the Black Sea, that's the last thing the Russians want, is an east-west economic corridor where you get Germany and the Netherlands and other UK investing in that. And then they start paying attention to, wait, why are there still 20% of Georgia occupied by Russian troops? Why do we have Russian troops here in all these different places? That's the last thing that the Kremlin wants. Now, three functional things that you highlighted that I'd like to briefly mention: air and missile defense, interoperability, military mobility. To me, this is our biggest vulnerability is air and missile defense. The U.S. has one Patriot battalion in all of Europe, and for sure that will focus on Ramstein to protect Ramstein Air Base if there's a conflict or a crisis. Where's the rest of the missile defense to protect all this critical infrastructure that we all need: airports, seaports, airfields, you name it. This is an area that needs significant investment, and I think Germany should really step up here. Secondly is military mobility. I think that deterrence depends on speed of recognition of what's happening, speed of decision, and then speed of assembly. How fast can you get there? Can we put a force in place in peacetime conditions to communicate to the Kremlin, we see what you're doing. Do not make the mistake that you think you could close the Suwalki corridor, for example, or do something in Romania before we could get there. And if the Russians think that they could do that, then I think the risk of them trying something, the so-called fait accompli scenario, I think that goes up. And I was impressed this morning looking at video of almost a dozen IL-76s flying out of Ulyanovsk in central Russia, taking troops into Armenia. I mean, their ability to move a lot of stuff real fast, that's important. And the alliance has to deal with that. And then finally, interoperability. We've been talking about interoperability forever, but the requirement has never been defined, which is why we still can't communicate securely or use all of our mission command systems in the multinational formations we have, because the requirement has not been defined. And I think the requirement should be secured tactical frequency FM free copying communications, a COP that is truly a COP, the common operating picture, that the subordinate unit's icon automatically populates the COP in the headquarters of the higher headquarters, no matter what system people are using, and digital fires. And I remember we tried at Grafenwehr with a U.S. Army battalion and a British artillery. It was a U.S. Army brigade and a U.S. British battalion to do digital fires with artillery and radar. Couldn't do it. And if the U.S. and U.K. can't do it, how do we expect to do it with Romanians and Poles?
I suppose there's a challenge that remains. I mean, if, as you rightfully said, if US and UK are still facing the same challenge, but as military technology is advancing really fast, US's budget, US's push for reform, I think a lot of countries would, again, that question is set to remain for a while on our horizon. But before I wrap up, I think one final question, which will be highly relevant for us here in the UK, is you worked with the UK all throughout your military career. Obviously, NATO matters a lot for us, and British forces, British commanders are all across the structures with the US. In an honest assessment, in a conversation, or how do you see the current British contribution to NATO? I think strategically it's increasing a lot again because of the Brexit process, because of kind of UK reformulating its engagement with the mainland Europe and with the US and with some of these issues, and increasing awareness in London of the threat that China poses, right? Because it took a while for London to have a unified attitude over China rather than just mere economic lens or mere security lens, or etc. How do you see the present and also the future of British contributions to NATO? I mean, is this a direction that you think UK can continue to punch above its weight and support, even though our military size, our capabilities obviously are no match to US, but given other strategic divergences with our allies and their own capabilities, is there still a unique role for the UK to play within NATO?
Well, first of all, the United States needs to demonstrate that we don't take UK contributions for granted, or as some kind of little brother or something like that. And British capabilities don't have to match US, but we should complement each other. And and I'm saying this with all candor, having served under British command and alongside British troops, and had British troops under American command. The quality of the non-commissioned officer, the quality of the officer is as good as it's ever been. I love the willingness to innovate and experiment, to test things. I remember James Everard, when he was Commanding Field Army, doing things to test readiness, really rolling up the sleeves to try and figure out how to do things. Or when the British Army did a convoy using one of every kind of vehicle to get to the Baltics to test military mobility. Or General Carter, back when he was CGS, telling me about a movement where they took a reconnaissance troop and drove it. It had to get to Africa. And so it did a convoy through UK, crossed the channel, went through Europe, down to Spain, and then crossed the straits into Africa. What an incredible test of maintenance, junior leadership, but also to demonstrate to everybody, like, here we are. That was the inspiration for me to do the Dragoon ride that we did with our strikers out of Estonia to bring them back home to Vilsek. It was after hearing General Nick describe that. What the U.S. Army needs from the British Army. We hope that the British Army will always have a 3-star core headquarters arc. I mean, that's obviously important to us. We invest almost 40 officers and NCOs there, including a general officer. Now, not everybody thinks adding a general adds help, but that shows you how important we think it is. We always hope that the British Army will have an operational division headquarters that, because you can attach capabilities to division headquarters and the corps headquarters. And we provide an American general to support that as well. We depend on the British contribution to the American Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Orzic, Poland. I hope that continues, as well as the British-led battle group in Estonia. We hope that the British will continue to support training of Ukraine, part of that training mission. And then have the depth to sustain that. The general rule, it takes 3 to make 1 for rotational employment. That's expensive, and that takes a lot. So the quality of what the British Army brings, that's unchanged. It's the quantity, of course, which is a decision that the British Ministry of Defense will have to make. But I hope you can always protect that quality and that innovative sort of spirit.
General, thank you so much. It's been a truly fascinating and rich conversation. I think we have covered a really wide geography, so many issues, but I think one of the key takeaways that I walk away with from this conversation is how resilient NATO has been, how actually its strategic importance, far from disappearing, is actually as fresh and valid as ever, and the roles that it plays for our security and management of conflicts and crises, I think is more clear to me than it was perhaps before 2014 or 2010 or 11. And thanks to everybody who watched this. If you want to watch more videos with experts and professionals discussing some of these issues of relevance for UK defense and foreign policy, you can do so on www.chacer.org.uk. And thank you.